way so I don't splatter it everywhere. The subcommittee will come to order. Good afternoon, everybody. We've called this markup to order today to consider 4 important measures that touch on pressing challenges the United States faces in the Asia-Pacific region. After the conclusion of this brief business meeting, we'll proceed immediately to our scheduled hearing on the administration's fiscal year 2018 state and foreign operations budget request for the East Asia and Pacific region. Pursuant to notice, we have 4 bipartisan measures on our agenda this afternoon. As members were notified yesterday, it is the intention of the chair to consider today's business in block so that we can proceed promptly to our hearing. All members may have 5 days to insert remarks into the record and without objection. The following measures and amendments will be considered in block. House Resolution 422, urging adherence to the one country, two-system policy as prescribed in the joint declaration between the government of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and the government of the People's Republic of China on the question of Hong Kong. House Resolution 445, honoring the life and legacy of Liu Xiaobo for his steadfast commitment to the protection of human rights, political freedoms, free markets, democratic elections, government accountability, and peaceful change in the People's Republic of China. And Sherman Amendment 20 to H Resolution 445. H.R. 2732, the North Korea Travel Control Act, with Sherman Amendment 21 in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 2732 and H.R. 3320, to direct the Secretary of State to develop a strategy to regain observer status for Taiwan in the World Health Organization and for other purposes. Before turning to our ranking member, I recognize myself to speak on today's business. H Resolution 422, introduced by Ranking Member Engel, will help draw greater attention to recent developments in Hong Kong, where actions by the government of China have interfered in Hong Kong's autonomy and caused the civil liberties and caused a chill in civil liberties. The erosion of the one country, two systems policy threatens to destroy what makes Hong Kong unique and vibrant, so I commend the ranking member for introducing this legislation. Congressman Meadows' H Resolution 445, honoring the life of Liu Xiaobo, is a fitting way for the Congress to pay its respect to this remarkable proponent of democracy and Nobel Prize winner. Liu's widow, Liu Zi, remains detained by the agents of the Chinese government, raising the same concerns about access to quality medical care that have been implicated in her husband's death while he was in prison. Ranking Member Sherman's amendment will strengthen the resolution as it relates to Li Shi, and I am proud to support this amendment as well as the underlying text. Congressman Schiff's North Korea Travel Control Act will be an important way for Congress to refine the administration's recently announced policy of banning travel to North Korea. I'm looking forward to sending this along to the full committee with the fixes made by Ranking Member Sherman's substitute amendments so we can get this important policy right. Finally, H.R. 3320 responds to Taiwan's disinvitation from the World Health Assembly this year. U.S. efforts led Taiwan's inclusion over the last several years, and Taiwan punches above its weight in the fight against global disease. Unfortunately, China has taken a short-sighted policy to expel Taiwan from this forum and restricts its overall international space. This legislation will update U.S. law on Taiwan's participation in the WHO to improve our strategy to promote Taiwan's place in the world health. I now recognize our ranking member, Mr. Sherman, for any remarks he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased that we have in front of us 4 excellent bills and that they are bipartisan, as the work of our committee usually is. I support all 4 bills, namely the ones regarding Hong Kong, China, North Korea, and Taiwan. I'm a co-sponsor of all 4. The first bill, H.Res. 422, urges autonomy for Hong Kong that is consistent with the one country, two systems policy. It is critical that we send a strong message to China that we value our relationship with Hong Kong and that our relations with the People's Republic will suffer if the PRC seeks to interfere with the democratic processes in Hong Kong. The second bill, H-Res 445, honors the life and legacy of Liu Xiaobo for his commitment to human rights and political freedoms in China. Liu received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2010, and he died, unfortunately, earlier this month while serving an 11-year prison sentence, and died in part due to inadequate medical care. My amendment to this bill seeks protection for Mrs. Liu Xie, the widow of Mr. Liu. This amendment urges the United States government to continuously advocate for Liu Xie's release when meeting with Chinese authorities. It arises from suggestions from our colleague, Congressman Levin. The third bill is H.R. 2732, the North Korea Travel Control Act, which requires travel restrictions on travel to North Korea. This bill is authored by Representative Schiff and Joe Wilson and includes provisions that will prevent tourist travel while allowing limited legitimate travel to North Korea. I, as you noted in your opening statement, Mr. Chairman, have an amendment in the nature of a substitute to this bill that I believe reflects the consensus of leadership of both this subcommittee and our full committee. The State Department has also announced that it will have a policy to heavily restrict travel to North Korea. The State Department is correct to restrict travel to North Korea and, in effect, eliminate tourism to North Korea. However, we should make sure that aid workers, journalists, NGOs, and experts are able to travel to North Korea when they can, especially if they can shed light on conditions there, and we should allow travel when circumstances allow. It is doubtful that we can enact this legislation in time for so that it goes into effect before the State Department's restrictions go into effect. So I hope this bill will serve as a strong statement to the State Department that they need to make sure in their action, and it'll be their action that will govern at least for a while, ensure that humanitarian relief workers, journalists, and some other limited categories of travelers, to include people traveling for family reunions, may travel to North Korea when appropriate. Finally, the fourth bill, H.R. 3320, asks the Secretary of State to develop a strategy to regain observer status for Taiwan in the World Health Organizations. This is important for world health. You can't exclude a country like Taiwan for political reasons if you're concerned with fighting disease that affects people all over the world. And our chairman has also indicated why this bill is important. So I would hope that we would ultimately move to adopt my two amendments and then to pass en bloc all four of these bills with the support of this subcommittee to the full committee, and I would yield back.
I thank the ranking members for his comments, and we'll next go to Mr. Steve Shabbat from Ohio.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and the measures being considered today are both timely and important. First of all, I'd like to speak on H.Res. 422, urging China to adhere to the one country, two systems policy with respect to Hong Kong. The United States-Hong Kong relationship runs deep. Unfortunately, it has become abundantly clear in recent years that China is taking systematic steps to limit and restrict the autonomy of Hong Kong and its people. Less than 2 weeks ago, 4 legislators were disqualified from serving on Hong Kong's Legislative Council, or LegCo. All of these disqualified members represent new political parties that support greater autonomy for Hong Kong and self-determination of the city's future relationship with China. To add insult to injury, they are expected to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in fees for the government's legal costs. This development, to me, reeks of China's central government attempting to purge the LegCo of its pro-democracy members. Now, none of this is really surprising. However, it emphasizes the importance of our support for the original agreement that was struck between the UK and China as it pertains to Hong Kong. That is exactly what I stand with my colleagues who worked on HRES 422 as we together we want to ensure that China adheres to the one country, two systems policy and respects the rights of our brave friends in Hong Kong. Lastly, I'd like to voice my support for H.R. 3320. I'm also a sponsor of. This bill requires that the State Department develop a strategy for Taiwan to regain its inclusion in the World Health Organization. Taiwan is an important contributor to global health and has provided great research and development to help combat some of the world's worst diseases. I believe it would behoove our partners around the world to give Taiwan a seat at the table, at the very least. And I'll add that almost 20 years ago, I introduced the first WHO Taiwan resolution, HJ-Res 126, along with my colleague then, Representative Sherrod Brown. Not sure whatever happened to him. He's over in the Senate now. I've long supported Taiwan's participation at the WHO, and I'm proud to be showing that continued support today. I would also mention that relative to Taiwan, way back in the day, my friend and colleague, Mr. Rohrabacher, and I were the two Republicans who were co-founders of the Congressional Taiwan Caucus, along with two Democrats, one being that other guy from Ohio, Sherrod Brown, that I just mentioned, and Bob Wexler, Robert Wexler from Florida. The four of us started that, and here at least the two of us still are. So,
We're getting old.
for those who couldn't heard, Mr. Rohrabacher commented that he and I are both getting old, and he's right. Okay, yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate your comments. Ms. Perry, do you have any comments? Then we'll next go and recognize Mr. Joe Wilson from the great state of South Carolina.
Thank you, Chairman Ted Yoho, for your leadership and for the opportunity to speak before the committee today on H.R. 2732, the North Korea Travel Control Act. When Congressman Adam Schiff and I introduced this bipartisan legislation in May, Otto Warmbier was still being held illegally by the tyrannical regime in North Korea. In the weeks following, a tragedy unfolded. Otto, a UVA student, returned to the United States, but in a coma from which he never recovered. Sadly, Otto's story, while tragic, is not unique. Otto was one of 17 Americans detained by North Korea in the last 10 years. 3 are still being held. I have traveled to North Korea on a congressional delegation in 2003, led by the former Congressman Kurt Weldon, which had been invited to the city of Pyongyang after Baghdad had been liberated, getting the attention of the dictator. While there, I saw firsthand how every dollar in North Korea, including the revenue from tourism, goes toward subjugation of its citizens and toward the very weapons development program it uses to threaten American families. Additionally, the regime also has no reservations about illegally detained Americans as bargaining chips in an attempt to score credibility on the world stage. However, despite the risk and despite knowing how the regime uses tourist revenue, Western tourism to the regime is increasing, even knowing they could be incarcerated. It is time that we enact meaningful restrictions on tourist travel to totalitarian North Korea, and I urge the passage of this legislation. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. The chair will now recognize Mr. Connolly from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the ranking member, Mr. Sherman, for bringing these bills to the subcommittee for its consideration today. These measures reinforce long-standing U.S. foreign policy with respect to Taiwan and Hong Kong, protect U.S. citizens from the risks of travel to North Korea, and honor a giant of the Chinese human rights movement who will not be forgotten, Liu Xiaobo. I'd like to talk in particular about 2 of the 4 measures. I support all 4. H.R. 3320, to direct the Secretary of State to develop a strategy to regain observer status for Taiwan in the World Health Organization. As co-chair of the Congressional Taiwan Caucus, I particularly want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for introducing H.R. 3320 and for inviting me to be an original co-sponsor of this bill, which recognizes Taiwan's long-standing participation in the World Health Organization and works to improve the U.S. strategy for promoting Taiwan's observer status going forward. Public health should not be a political football. Taiwan's meaningful participation in the World Health Assembly is in the best interest not only of the people of Taiwan, but of the entire international community. Taiwan's been a critical partner in numerous global health issues, including the Ebola crisis, and the United States should continue its support of Taiwan's engagement with the World Health Organization and other international organizations to address global health and disease prevention needs. The spread of diseases, especially our concern about endemic viruses that could cross boundaries in a second, does not respect political delineations. And Taiwan is no different. We need Taiwan's help and participation in the full international health community. The second bill I wanted to address, Mr. Chairman, is H.R. 2732. I also am co-chair of the Korea Caucus, and also glad to be an original co-sponsor of H.R. 2732, the North Korea Travel Control Act. The North Korean regime's fatal exploitation of a Virginia student, college student, Otto Warmbier, demonstrates the extreme risk facing any American who visits that rogue state. During the past 2 years, Kim Jong-un's regime has arrested 3 other Americans, including another Virginian, Kim Dong-chul, who remain in detention today. This bill protects U.S. citizens from the risk of travel to North Korea by restricting travel that would pose an imminent danger to the public health or the physical safety of the United States travelers. The legislation provides important exceptions for several travel purposes, including professional reporters, compelling humanitarian considerations, official U.S. government travel, official intergovernmental organizational business, family reunifications, or other licenses issued by the United States Treasury Department. I urge adoption of all 4 measures before us, and I thank the Chair and Ranking Member for their consideration and support.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly, for the comments. Hearing no further requests for recognition, the question occurs on approving the items considered in block. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, a clarification. We're adopting my 2 amendments and
Thank you for that clarification.
thank you.
The question occurs on approving all items considered in block, including all amendments. And again, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the items considered in block are agreed to. Without objection, the measure considered in block are ordered, favorably reported to the full committee as amended, and the staff is directed to make any technical conforming changes. That includes the markup. The subcommittee stands adjourned.
Okay.
Yeah, right now. We're going to give the media 2 minutes to pack up, and we'll start the full committee, or the subcommittee hearing. The subcommittee will come to order. Members present will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the official hearing record. Without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 5 calendar days to allow statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record subject to length limitations in the rules. Good afternoon again. We call this hearing to order pursuant to our congressional oversight responsibilities to discuss the administration's fiscal year 2018 state and foreign operations budget request for the East Asia Pacific region. On behalf of the subcommittee, I thank the panel for joining us today to share the insights and expertise they have gained over, and I don't want this to be offended, over their lengthy diplomatic careers as we deliberate this important topic. I didn't write those. East Asia and the Pacific represents the opportunities and challenges of this century like no other part of the world. Just over 30% of the world's population lives in this region. It accounts for the same share of global GDP and continues to lead the world in annual GDP growth. 4 of the top 10 U.S. trading partners are located in this area. 5 of the United States' 7 collective defense arrangements are located in the Asia-Pacific region, where over 63,000 U.S. troops are stationed. This region is home to what many believe to be our most urgent existential threat, the nuclear belligerence of North Korea. We also see rising Islamist militancy and major territorial disputes in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and the Sea of Japan. About a third of the world's maritime trade passes through these disputed areas, as does most of the energy supply of South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, all critical U.S. security partners. And not least, this is the same area over which China, our chief global rival, seeks hegemony. The importance of East Asia to U.S. interests is beyond doubt. If the United States is to remain relevant as a global leader, we can't sit out the transformation happening among our neighbors across the Pacific. Our diplomatic engagement in the region should advance our interests in the opportunities of Asia, and should also be the first line of American defense among its many security challenges. As Secretary of Defense Mattis famously said, when American diplomats don't have the resources they need, our military needs to buy more ammunition. I applaud the administration for their efforts to move towards a more fiscally responsible executive branch, but I'm concerned that the symbolism of cuts have been given more importance than the actual value of individual programs. It's worth reiterating that even before this year's foreign operations budget was slashed by 30%, it accounted for just 1% of annual federal outlay. Empty gestures are not the way to truly rein in our out-of-control government spending, especially if they undermine U.S. interests. Business logic dictates that we should continue projects that deliver a good return on investment, yet I see many potentially sound investments that have been left out of this year's request. For example, foreign military financing grants have been mostly stripped out of this year's budget. In the Asia-Pacific theater, these grants have been used to advance U.S. national security, for example, by boosting our allies' ability to counter China's maritime aggression. Similarly, the United States has traditionally supported democratic reform, in part because working with friendly democracies is better for American peace, security, and influence, and it builds stronger relationships with our country. But this year's request drops support for democracy and governance reforms for Cambodia, which is just 1 year away from an election that could help transform it away from an autocracy. Overall, the most worrying implication of this year's EAP, Eastern Asia Pacific budget, may be that it reflects a continuing misalignment of the administration's strategic planning with the importance of Asia. Even during the so-called pivot to Asia, budgetary commitments for Asia were the smallest of any region. This year's request would cut this by a further 46%, the largest percentage cut for any region other than Europe. This afternoon, we discussed the details of this year's state and foreign operations request for East Asia and the Pacific. We'll try to strike a balance between fiscal responsibility and sound investments in our national security and other strategic priorities. In conducting our oversight of this request, We will seek to advance the national interest by making sure that U.S. diplomatic engagement is up to the multitude of challenges and opportunities presented by this dynamic region. I thank the witnesses for joining us today to discuss this important topic, and without objection, the witnesses' written statements will be entered into the hearing record, and I now turn to our ranking member for any remarks he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We should discuss security, economics, democracy, and human rights. As to security, our security interests cover familiar and new terrain. We have alliances with Japan, South Korea, Australia, Thailand, the Philippines. We have security relations with New Zealand and Singapore, and are building partnerships with Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia. And of course, we are dedicated to the security of Taiwan. These alliances and partnerships provide stability in the Asia-Pacific region and counter terrorism, piracy, and provide for humanitarian assistance in the wake of natural disasters. The huge proposed reduction in the Asia-Pacific diplomatic and aid budgets sends entirely the wrong message. If we do not reassure our partners of our commitment to the region, they'll be inclined to go with China. It is especially absurd to have a system of slashing our aid and diplomacy and public policy outreach to the Asia-Pacific region while massively increasing our military, most of that going to the Asia-Pacific region. Let's talk about North Korea. We've got a huge threat. Assistant Secretary Thornton observed that North Korea has no intention of abandoning its nuclear program in the current environment. In 2 hearings this year, I mentioned the possibility of moderating our objectives to achieve a freeze of their nuclear and missile program together with in-person monitoring. North Korea is believed to have roughly 20 nuclear weapons, maybe producing 3 to 7 a year unless we're able to get a freeze. Now, of course, that does not meet American political needs for politicians and operatives here in Washington. You meet those political needs by pounding the table, saying that any North Korean nuclear weapons is completely unacceptable. We've been doing that for the last 17 years, and people say it's a complete failure because within a year or 2, my city will be subject to North Korean nuclear weapons. But it's not a failure because it's met the political needs of the people who keep bleeding the same slogans over and over again. So if the objective is to reach a consensus in Washington and all say the same things, and the policy is going well, if the goal is to try to keep this country safe from North Korean ICBMs, then I suggest we make it clear to China that they cannot have access to U.S. markets unabated on the one hand and continue their current policy toward North Korea on the other. Of course, a lot of money would be lost by a lot of big companies if we were to do that or even threaten to do that, and so we won't. We will continue to meet the political needs of Washington and the economic needs of Wall Street. Moving on to economics, we've got a $340 billion trade deficit with China, $69 billion with Japan, $83 billion with the Southeast Asian countries. It's about time that we do something about that. Access to the U.S. market should be dependent upon fair and balanced trade. As to human rights, we see that Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam are not democratic, and democracy has regressed in Thailand. Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines are democratic to a varying degree, and Myanmar, also known as Burma, has made a transition from military rule to something that is at least seems to be civilian government. Given the fundamental importance of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, why has our FY 2018 budget proposal slashed support for these efforts in Asia? We know that 121 3- and 4-star military officers, retired military officers, have said that if we slash our diplomatic and aid efforts, this will undermine American security. That's why we need a budget that reflects our values. Instead, we are being told, slash the diplomacy, slash the aid, slash the money for communication with the peoples, and somehow instead increase the military budget by 50, 60, 70 billion dollars and pivot that military toward Asia. I suggest that that is a dangerous and short-sighted approach to budgeting, but budgeting is policy, and I yield back.
Thank you for those comments, and very direct, and I look forward to an engaging hearing here. We next go to Mr. Shabbat of Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this important hearing this afternoon. There's just two topics I'd like to comment. The first being Taiwan, as one of the, as I mentioned before, one of the co-founders of the Congressional Taiwan Caucus. I've been interested in this issue for over 20 years now and involved in it. And I remember when I first came to Congress back then, there were a couple hundred missiles aimed at Taiwan from across the Taiwan Straits from the PRC to Taiwan. That has gone from a couple hundred now to 1,600 approximately. The PRC has been bullying Taiwan for years and years now, and I would just say that we ought to be very clear that we're committed to the Taiwan Relations Act and the 6 assurances, and Taiwan needs to beef up their military. The best way to avoid conflict is to be strong and not perceived as being weak. And very quickly on North Korea, you've got a madman there. We've had 3 administrations that have had the luxury of being able to enter into talks about the threat from North Korea. And essentially what would happen is, as a result of these talks, we'd end up giving them stuff, oil, food, other necessities that they couldn't provide to themselves because everything they have goes to their military. And that also freed up these things because we're giving them food that they could give food to the military. And so they would say they'd back off from their nuclear program, but they cheated every time. And it was a luxury, I say, because they couldn't hit us. They could hit our allies. They could hit Japan. They could hit our military forces, but they couldn't hit us. Now they can, and there's only one thing that I think gets China's attention, and that's if we seriously discuss nuclear programs for South Korea and Japan. I think that's the only thing that'll get China's attention to get them to get North Korea to back off. I know 2 people have been saying this for years, myself and Charles Krauthammer. I don't know which one of us said it first, but I've been preaching it a long time, and I think that's the only thing that'll work. I yield back.
I appreciate your comments, and again, I think this is going to be very engaging. We next go to Mr. Connolly of Virginia. Okay, Mr. Bear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Sherman. You know, the countries in East Asia rely quite heavily on U.S. assistance for their national and regional security, particularly in Southeast Asia. But yet, when we look at the FY 2018 budget request, you know, that's not reflected in here. You know, in there, the rationale for this budget says to reinforce a rules-based order in the region by building an international commitment to defeat ISIS and defending freedom of navigation in the region's maritime spaces, including the South China Sea, with U.S. leadership. But the budget request proposes eliminating foreign military financing altogether for the countries in Asia. U.S. foreign assistance to Indonesia is cut by 31%, 56% to the Philippines, 26% to Vietnam, and these cuts flatly contradict the administration's statement of commitment to the region. It's my belief that the budget puts America and our standing in the region at risk, and while administration officials have stated that we remain committed to Asia, our words have to be backed up by our deeds, and this budget does not reflect that commitment, so I really do worry that we jeopardize our relationships in Asia. Our support for our allies and partners in Asia increase global and regional stability, and better stability there means better security here at home, and I yield back.
Appreciate my colleagues' remarks. We'll next go to Mr. Connolly from Virginia.
I thank my friend. And I want to echo our chairman, Mr. Yoho's comments about the draconian nature of the budget cuts proposed. This isn't a reduction. This is gutting. To cut almost half of the aid to an entire region, the biggest cut in the world outside of Europe and Eurasia, speaks volumes. You don't make a country great through retreat. You make a country weak through retreat, and you hand over assets and dynamics to China in this region. That's the consequence. You cannot cut 46% and fight terrorism. You cannot cut all foreign military financing and fight terrorism. You cannot cut huge amounts of money to the Philippines and Indonesia when you're worried about ISIS-affiliated organizations suddenly resurfacing or surfacing in those countries. That is contradictory. It shows a complete lack of understanding of what we do through the Foreign Assistance Program. And Ms. Thornton, I hope you'll take that message back. On one final point, Ms. Steele, I saw you went to Maryknoll College in the Philippines. I went to Maryknoll College in Chicago, Illinois. So you need a promotion.
Gentleman yields back, and with that, we are thankful to be joined today by Ms. Susan Thornton, Acting Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of East Asia and Pacific Affairs at the U.S. Department of State, and Ms. Gloria Steele, Acting Assistant Administrator of the Bureau for Asia at the U.S. Agency for International Development. And as our meetings in the past, what I encourage you to do is be engaging. These guys will be, this panel will be, and it's the ideas that you give us here that will form policy to help bring some, hopefully, some diplomatic responses or actions so that we can have peaceful a resolve of what's going on in the Asia-Pacific theater, whether it's North Korea with the threats of nuclear weapons or the aggression of China further creating a hegemony in that area. So I appreciate it. Ms. Thornton, if you would go ahead and just for house cleaning, make sure you turn your microphone on. You'll have 5 minutes. And then we're going to ask members to respectfully try to stay to the 5-minute time limit. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate you being here, and thank you. Ms. Thornton, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Very happy to be here with you today to discuss the budget situation for FY18.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, could I ask Ms. Thornton to pull the microphone closer to her so we can all hear?
Thank you.
Okay. Is that better? Can you hear me now? Okay. Well, thank you again, Mr. Ranking Member, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to testify regarding the President's fiscal year FY 2018 budget request for the East Asia and Pacific. The Bureau of East Asia and Pacific Affairs is responsible for engaging a region that represents a quarter of the world's population and GDP, some of the world's fastest growing markets, and as you said, Mr. Chairman, 4 of our top 10 trading partners. Despite all of its dynamism and promise, we do, however, face serious challenges to our security interests, and we must address these to keep the United States, our allies, and our partners safe. The FY 2018 budget request supports the President's vision to meet 4 key challenges: addressing the North Korea threat, maintaining American leadership and influence in the East Asia region, defeating ISIS and combating transnational crime, and creating jobs and other economic opportunities for Americans. The most pressing threat that we face today, of course, is North Korea. The DPRK's continued pursuit of nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them is not new, but the regime has accelerated its development of new capabilities over the past 2 years. To address this growing threat, we are stepping up our global pressure campaign in coordination with allies and partners around the world to convince the DPRK regime to return to serious denuclearization talks. Maintaining American leadership in Asia requires us to work with our allies and partners on a range of challenges. Our budget request allows us to bolster Southeast Asian cooperation on maritime security and the rule of law, which underpin regional security and economic stability. We support peaceful resolution of the contested maritime claims in the South China Sea. Destabilizing actions such as Chinese land reclamation, construction, and militarization of disputed features makes it harder for the region to resolve these disagreements peacefully. Effective public diplomacy is another key ingredient for American leadership in the region. We use educational, cultural, and digital exchange programs to communicate U.S. policy perspectives to foreign governments and influential members of their publics, including media, emerging leaders, thought leaders, legislators, and civil society across Asia. Our FY18 request requires improved efficiencies in U.S. public diplomacy that will enhance our ability to remain this dynamic region's partner of choice on a wide range of shared challenges. And even as ISIS faces battlefield losses in the Middle East, the siege of Marawi City by an ISIS-affiliated group in the southern Philippines demonstrates the group's lingering appeal in Southeast Asia. Our FY 2018 EAP Foreign Assistance request includes resources to support efforts to defeat ISIS and to counter transnational crime, a funding source for ISIS, of course, across Southeast Asia. Our law enforcement and judicial sector programs have enhanced recipient countries' capacities to identify, prosecute, and effectively isolate terrorists and other criminals. Regionally, our border security and information sharing programs prevent foreign terrorist fighter transit, trace illicit financing, and counter trafficking in goods and people. These programs help to ensure that Southeast Asia's economic integration does not leave it more vulnerable to terrorism, cyber attacks, or other transnational crimes. And finally, the FY 2018 EAP Foreign Assistance request will support economic diplomacy to level the playing field and reduce trade barriers for U.S. businesses. Multilateral work with APEC and ASEAN will lead to truly free and fair trade with the region's more than 24 economies, while bilateral U.S. economic programs in Vietnam, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Burma will hopefully lay the groundwork for high-quality, free and fair trade with these key partners. We will take the lead in setting and raising trade standards across the region, supported by the negotiation of bilateral trade agreements as appropriate. Thank you for inviting me today to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Ms. Thornton, thank you. And Ms. Steele, if you would go ahead and don't forget to push the red button. Thank you, ma'am.
Chairman Yoho, Ranking Member Sherman, distinguished subcommittee members, thank you very much for inviting me to testify today to talk about USAID's role in advancing U.S. foreign policy priorities in East Asia and the Pacific Islands. Asia's security and economies are deeply intertwined with our own. Asia is a leading destination for American exports, which support some 3.4 million jobs here in the U.S. By 2030, Asia will become home to more than half of the world's consumer class. Asia's growing market potential presents tremendous opportunity to create U.S. jobs and support regional and global prosperity. However, complex development challenges threaten to derail this trajectory. Asia's income inequality gap has drastically widened over the past 2 decades. Asian countries are under pressure to provide essential services on an unprecedented scale. And as mentioned earlier, ISIS is increasing local attacks and recruiting foreign fighters. A host of other development challenges hold the region back, ranging from pandemic threats to human trafficking. The President's fiscal year 2018 budget request for USAID's foreign assistance in this region is approximately $235 million. This request will enable USAID to continue its vital role in addressing key development challenges in the region, while strengthening our national security, advancing U.S. economic interests, and asserting U.S. global leadership and influence. On national security, USAID helps to counter threats to the U.S. before they mature. They include a focus on preventing radicalization to violence by addressing its underlying drivers. It also includes leading regional efforts to combat human and wildlife trafficking. And it includes working to prevent health threats from reaching our country by addressing them abroad. We help to reduce non-tariff trade barriers, protect intellectual property rights, and support the emergence of a consumer class that can buy American goods and services. We also support ASEAN and APEC in achieving these objectives. We are leading the world in improving global health, particularly maternal and child health, malaria, and tuberculosis. We are also demonstrating leadership that reflects our core American values through life-saving humanitarian assistance. Next, I'd like to provide a brief overview of our programs in key countries. Indonesia. Indonesia shares our concern about the evolving threats from extremists. In response, we are reorienting our programs and designing new ones. Our focus is on strengthening moderate voices, bolstering community resilience through radicalization, and developing the capacity of Indonesian institutions to break the link between corruption and extremism. We are also improving access to justice for marginalized communities. Our work in Indonesia strengthens democratic governance and improves market for American businesses, including the Indonesia's $16 billion renewable energy market. Our efforts also include reducing maternal and child death and strengthening Indonesia's ability to contain infectious diseases. In the Philippines, where I grew up, the budget request supports programs to counter violent extremism, foster inclusive growth, and control tuberculosis. USAID is intensifying ongoing programs to address the threat of ISIS in Mindanao. In addition, we're helping citizens engage with government and bolster economic opportunities, especially among the youth. We will intensify our efforts to improve the court system's efficiency in order to strengthen the rule of law. The request supports our continued partnership with the Philippines to stimulate inclusive economic growth. USAID has helped advance reforms that benefit the Philippines as well as the U.S., including liberalizing foreign investment laws, establishing an antitrust body, and modernizing customs procedures. The Philippine budget also includes assistance that we provide to the Pacific Island countries, 12 of them, and they are focused on disaster preparedness. In Burma, USAID will continue efforts to foster national peace and reconciliation and maintain the momentum for democratic and economic reforms, as well as improve the lives of the people of Burma. We will continue to respond to humanitarian needs of vulnerable populations, including Rohingya, and will continue working towards a solution to violence in Rakhine. In Vietnam, our assistance focuses on strengthening the U.S.-Vietnam partnership. We are also helping to level the playing field for U.S. businesses in Vietnam by helping become more market-oriented and committed to good governance. And finally, in Cambodia, we have helped to significantly drive down malaria, TB, infant and child mortality. The budget request supports our efforts to build on these gains. We have a regional program that's based in Bangkok, which will focus on activities that combat human and wildlife trafficking and illegal and unregulated fishing. Mr. Chairman, Committee, investing in development in East Asia Pacific is not only good for our allies and friends in Asia, but it remains in our national interest. In helping build more stable, open, and prosperous societies overseas, we enhance our own prosperity and strengthen our security. Thank you, and I look forward to your counsel and questions.
Thank you both for your great testimony. We look forward to talking with you. And Ms. Thornton, you were talking about North Korea is probably the most urgent thing, and I think we're all in agreement. And I think we're all in agreement that the expansion and the aggression of what we see with China in the South China Seas, declaring the South China Sea as sovereign, building islands initially as peaceful navigational purposes that have morphed into militarized islands with weapon systems on there, radar systems, landing strips. So the rhetoric doesn't match the actions, and we've seen this over and over again. And if you go back to the agreement between Great Britain and Hong Kong, when they made the agreement and passed the control of that back, there was a 50-year plan. And that 50-year plan, they were supposed to be freedom of speech, democracy, and all those things are supposed to be left in place, yet here we are 20 years and we see it's not true. So we've kind of seen this story over and over again. And you know, with us cutting the budgets at state to save money, and we do. We need to be fiscally responsible because we have our own tsunami coming if we don't change course in this country and focus on the things that are the drivers of the out-of-control spending. But to cut the budgets at state to save money in the hopes of strengthening our presence and growing strategies and make stronger alliances in that area reminds me of the old veterinarian who was a cow rancher, and he would always, he never had the best gates or the best fences, and he says you can't starve a profit into your cattle, but he would feed them, he would take care of them, he would nurture them, and it'd be like planting a garden and hoping to have a bountiful crop or a harvest, but you don't want to fertilize it. We need to make sure that what we do, we get the biggest bang out of our buck for the American people so that we can have peace in that area. We can have strong alliances. We can focus on economics, on national security, on trade, and cultural exchanges. And my question to you, an American first foreign policy is the goal, but I fear it will become increasingly difficult to obtain if we lose our influence in the Asia-Pacific to China. How does the administration plan to adapt to ensure that the United States remain a regional power? And I have a follow-up question if you guys would tackle that one.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think what I would say first is that, you know, the budget that we have presented does reflect hard choices, but we should also remember that for the East Asia Pacific region, we have traditionally been less than 2% of foreign assistance spending globally. That means, you know, in the East Asia Pacific region, we have always gotten a lot of bang for our buck on what we have spent in the region. And I think one of the ways that we do that is whether it's an America First foreign policy, we're always doing it with America not alone. We are leveraging our money with other partners in the region, with the private sector, and what we're going to be doing and what we're going to be having to do with this budget is to be doing that even more efficiently and effectively going on in the future. One of the things that many of the members raised was the issue of security in East Asia. The U.S. has traditionally provided a lot of the security and stability in this region, which we've all come to treasure and which has underpinned the economic dynamism and prosperity of the region. Of course, our U.S. military contributes a lot to that security, and we have, over the years, built up great partnerships with our 5 treaty allies in the region and with a number of other partners that were mentioned by the Congressman Sherman. So I think what we want to do is continue those partnerships, continue to work with others in the region to build up this network. And we have invested a lot in these relationships already. We're working with the Department of Defense to make sure we have a steering committee that's been set up at the direction of Secretary Mattis and Secretary Tillerson to make sure that we're well coordinated on all of the needs that we see out there for security assistance, for example, and that we're working together, both departments, to come up with the necessary funding for that.
Okay, and I appreciate that, and I look forward to getting more of that out. Ms. Steele, if you would like to weigh in, you've got about 40 seconds. Your microphone.
I would just like to add that over the years, what we have done is work with our partner governments to make sure that they begin to mobilize their own resources to contribute and provide leverage to ours.
You know, and I appreciate you saying that because, you know, I came up here, I was one of the guys that wanted to get rid of foreign aid, but when you learn the process, I agree with General Mattis. Cut foreign aid, buy more bullets. There's a balance in there. And so our goal and the mantra that comes out of our office is go from aid to trade. And if you look at historically our top 15 trading partners, 12 of those were recipients of foreign aid. And that's what we want to do. And I think you guys have done a good job if you're only getting 2% of the foreign aid budget. I look forward to the suggestions that come out. I'm out of time, and we now turn to the ranking member, Mr. Sherman from California.
I agree with Mr. Shabbat, so I'll make that the key on North Korea is to persuade China to change its policy. The easy way to meet our political objectives here in Washington is to say we can get China to change its policy without doing anything we don't feel like doing. All we have to do is fly over to China, show them a picture of Kim Jong-un, show them a picture of his dead uncle, show them a picture of his dead half-brother, and persuade them to change their policy. Because after all, China doesn't understand Asia near as well as we do, and if they just listen to us, they will change. This is absolutely absurd. China's not going to change its policy toward North Korea till we change our policy, and we have one of 2 choices. Either make it plain to China that they cannot have access to our markets and continue their current policy toward North Korea, or we can build civil defense starting in Los Angeles. Ms. Thornton, back in the day, North Korea wanted a non-aggression pact with the United States. Cheney vetoed it because he wanted to invade and commit to aggression against North Korea. I realize this isn't a hot issue now, but what is the official U.S. position on whether we should have a non-aggression pact with North Korea?
I think what we're doing on North Korea, and I think it's...
If you don't know, if we don't have an official policy, just let me know.
Well, on a non-aggression pact with
Yeah.
North Korea, I mean, I think...
Are we interested in negotiating a non-aggression pact with
not-
North Korea? Yes,
well, we're
no,
not
or?
interested. Yeah, we're not interested. I mean, we are interested in peacefully resolving
Okay,
the
but-
issue on North Korea.
But we don't have a specific strategy on a non-aggression.
Well, we're not going for regime change, and we're not trying to have
Okay.
a collapse, and we don't want military conflict with
Okay.
North Korea. So
I believe that Ms. Steele has commented on the trade relationship. We have trade deficits with China of 340, Japan 69, 83 billion with Southeast Asia. Now, people often come here and they talk, things are wonderful because we have exports. But of course, the exports are dwarfed and increasingly dwarfed by the imports. What matters is the net trade. Getting 5,000 jobs while you're losing 10,000 jobs is not the way to build the U.S. economy. Ms. Thornton, does the administration have a policy that you're confident will reduce our trade deficit with East Asia by a significant amount over the next few years?
Well, I think what we're trying to do is
Do we
grow-
have a policy that will
Yes.
achieve those objectives?
I think we do
So
have a
you're
policy.
confident that when you come back here 3 years from now, our trade deficit is going to be substantially less than it is now?
I am confident that we're working in that direction, yes.
Working it, but, and how is this direction different from the last 3 years? Because
Well-
we didn't achieve that in the last 3 years. What are we doing different now?
Well, we're trying to grow the entire Asian economy, but enforce better the trade mechanisms that are in place and pursue agreements with countries where we have trade imbalances to try to right restrictions on market access and also try to.
And you're
right
saying
trade-
that wasn't true in 2014?
We've been doing.
We did it then, we're doing it now, we're going to keep doing it, and the definition of insanity is to keep doing the same thing we did then and expect a different result. The budget that the administration has proposed, does it save from the axe those diplomats that are working to push American exports, agriculture and manufacturing? Or does it cut our efforts in the State Department to promote our exports?
I don't think that the budget that we've presented reflects those kinds of cuts to our personnel, no. And we're certainly one of our.
So we're going to slash the State Department, but those officers that are promoting exports are not going to be slashed? Everybody else is going to be slashed a little bit more?
So I think, are you talking about the cuts to our operations
Yeah.
that have been proposed are not that significant, actually. So to personnel and things like that, there's not a major reduction there. And certainly
Islands.
not in the commercial promotion area.
Ms. Steele, why are we slashing our aid to islands that are so incredibly strategic and they received almost no aid, but now we're going down to zero for the Marshall Islands and Micronesia? Why shouldn't we at least continue our $500,000 a year aid to those two?
The President's budget requests include, we support the Pacific Island countries, which includes Marshall Islands and Micronesia, through a regional program that's run out of the Philippines. And the President has requested $5 million to support the countries in the Pacific. And so we will continue supporting them.
And is that a higher or lower rate of support than we had last year,
It is lower.
in spite of their strategic significance? So we're going to spend hundreds of billions of dollars to fight with China over little islets that we claim have strategic significance but really don't, and we're going to ignore the chance to spend a tiny, tiny fraction of that on the islands that are in the middle of the Pacific and dominate that area. I yield back.
We'll next go to Mr. Dana Rohrabacher of California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations on your assuming the chairmanship. And we appreciate, look forward to working with you in the years ahead. Let me just note that we have just ended 8 years of disintegration of major Western bulwarks throughout the world against various elements that are hostile to the United States, whether we're talking about what's going on in Turkey or the Philippines or what's happening in North Korea, where it didn't start off as one of our bulwarks, but now is threatening one of our bulwarks, which is South Korea and Japan. As far as American foreign aid, there are many people who believe that just giving money to people or trying to provide money and resources to promote various cultural elements of our society is a waste of American resources. And I know that if we take a look very closely at some of the expenditures that we have left that has been described, I don't necessarily believe that they are going to make things safer for us or better for those countries. So I am pleased that President Trump has kept his promise and is moving forward with theories based on what he believes and what some of us believe is best for the American people, rather than trying to buy off other people in other countries. In terms of North Korea, I was disappointed in your answer, but I do believe your answer reflects a policy that we don't have. And I would just suggest that well, I will refrain from using a pejorative phrase to describe the leader of North Korea. He is so much, it's easy to make fun of, but the fact is that this human being is a murderous, treacherous man who has murdered his own friends and family, and we cannot afford to have a nuclear weapon at his disposal that could hit the United States. And I would suggest that we owe Ronald Reagan a great debt, because Ronald Reagan insisted on moving forward in an aggressive way to build a missile defense system. And I remember him being belittled for saying that we can have a rocket, a bullet that can hit a bullet. Oh, it's impossible. He was belittled for that. And the fact that we went ahead, full steam ahead, and have developed such systems now gives us some leverage in dealing with this maniac. It was never intended to try to prevent us from preventing a major exchange between major powers of nuclear weapons, but it was just specifically for a case like this. And thank God he had the vision to move forward over and above being ridiculed for doing that. My recommendation is to this administration is our policy in North Korea should be that if indeed it appears that, again, this unstable, and that's a generous way of describing this dictator's personality, an unstable character like this looks like he is going to launch a rocket in, again, another missile with capabilities of threatening the United States. We should shoot that missile down. And if it continues, we should use our cyber capabilities to basically turn everything off in North Korea. And that's what I would recommend. I hope we have a president now that, instead of trying to buy loyalty or think he's going to buy peace, that we have one who I think will step up to the plate, and we'll wait and see. In terms of, let me ask one question, seeing that I gave my spiel here. Is there any indication, we have Burma and Vietnam, which Burma has supposedly made some progress. We have Aung San Suu Kyi now in a place where no one would have dreamed about 10, 15 years ago, and we all worked so hard to get her there, and I was part of that team. But in Vietnam, is there anything in Vietnam that would suggest to us that there is a democratic liberalization going on at all? And if not, why the heck are people so anxious to set up a trade treaty with a country that hasn't had that progress? Whoever wants to answer is fine with me.
Okay, thank you very much. On Burma, I would say, yes, we are working very hard to consolidate the gains there and to support governance in Burma. There are some issues still to work on there. Obviously, a lot of ethnic problems and unrest. There's a peace process which Aung San Suu Kyi has sponsored and which we have supported, and that we want to see continue to be successful. And we also are working very hard to make sure that the continued civilian governance over the military is proceeding in that country. On Vietnam, Vietnam is the fastest growing U.S. export market in the world, and you know, they are a significant economic partner of the United States. We have had a growing partnership and relationship with Vietnam on security in the East Asia region, particularly in Southeast Asia, and have found them to be partners in various areas of U.S. interest. We have not, unfortunately, made the gains that we would have hoped to in the human rights situation in Vietnam, but we do continue to work on that and have had a human rights dialogue going with them and continue to press them on those issues. And I'll let maybe Gloria Steele respond as well.
Let me just note that the fact that you were unable to really specify any real progress towards a democratic government in Vietnam indicates that the first things that you mentioned are not in our interest to start opening up. I do not believe, as I never believed with China, that just because we were going to open up our markets and have an economic relationship, which has built this monster that China is today, that that is in the interest of the United States if it does not couple with democratic reform. And we were promised it would be, but it never happened in China. There's been no democratic reform, and now we've created a monstrous threat to democracy.
Gentlemen's time expired. Ms. Steele, I'll come back to you, but we want to go on to Mr. Connolly right now.
I thank the chair and my friend who also worked for Ronald Reagan when I was here in the Hill during the Reagan years, and my job was to authorize the foreign aid budget. Let me just say I knew a little bit Ronald Reagan. Donald Trump is no Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan never cut the foreign aid budget by 46%. Ronald Reagan understood strength meant you go forward, you don't retreat. You don't create a vacuum in which your adversary can readily and smartly and enthusiastically step in. There's an Orwellian quality to this hearing, and I'm going to challenge both of you, and let me stipulate, for the record, in case so you don't get in trouble, you're loyal, officials in the United States government defending the indefensible, the Donald Trump foreign aid budget and State Department budget, but okay, we will stipulate you've done that. Ms. Thornton, you said to Mr. Sherman that there weren't really going to be significant personnel cuts. So let me talk about your boss. Your boss said otherwise. Your boss said, Mr. Tillerson, Secretary of State, 2,300 jobs will be cut. And he even specified how they'll be cut. 700 through buyouts and 1,600 through attrition. You think that's not significant? Because that's how you answered Mr. Sherman.
Well, I think I was speaking to the operational budget.
Well, how do you know?
For the East
If
Asia
there are that level of cuts, Ms. Thornton, how could you possibly sit here and testify that that won't affect operations? How would you know that?
I only know what is happening in the East Asia Pacific Bureau.
Have these cuts happened yet?
Not that I'm aware
No.
of.
So you don't know what the impact's going to be. And frankly, your answer to Mr. Sherman is nullified. You don't know whether, in fact, it would affect people who are in charge of exports, promoting U.S. exports. It could, in fact, have an appreciable impact, couldn't it? We don't know yet. I assume by your silence,
I mean, that's
you acquiesce.
not an area that that's a priority area that we would look to.
When
I would look to preserve.
If Secretary Tillerson isn't understating the number of cuts, you don't know the impact yet. That's really the answer to Mr. Sherman's question. And it's not a gratifying or reassuring answer. Ms. Steele, you talked about $235 million that will strengthen our vital programs. Now, I went to Maryknoll too, so I read George Orwell, and I think you did too. That's a 46% cut. Have you, in AID, notified all of your contractors, all of your nonprofits, and your own hands-on work, prepare for 46% cut? And are they doing that? Are they developing plans to absorb that cut? And oh, by the way, did you tell them by doing this we will strengthen our vital programs?
Yes, we are in constant discussions with our implementing partners.
I'm sure you are, but I didn't
they
ask that
realize-
question. Have you given them instructions to absorb a 46% cut? And have you told them, by the way, that will make you stronger, not weaker?
We have been talking to them about coming up with their share of the program.
You mentioned the progress. I'm sorry, but I only have 1 minute and 40
Sure.
seconds. You mentioned Cambodia. I've been to Cambodia. Malaria is a huge problem in Cambodia. Getting it under control, wonderful thing for them in terms of productivity, tourism, and the like. Are we a 2%er in the malarial prevention and eradication program in Cambodia, or are we a major player?
We are a major
Yes.
player and have helped them
Right.
significantly.
So we're not, this isn't like, well, we're kind of a bit player. In malaria in Cambodia, we're actually a big player.
Right.
And to absorb a 46% cut, I mean, the Cambodian government said, great idea. That will make us stronger. We like that.
Actually, Congressman Conley, we told them right from the start, and they have agreed that they will begin to assume the costs of our support to
Begin
them.
to assume.
In
This
2020
46% cut doesn't phase in. It happens in this fiscal year if it's adopted.
And there will be, they have they have achieved significant
So
gains.
your testimony
They
to
have-
this committee, you are absolutely going on record reassuring us that there will be no step backward in the malaria eradication program in Cambodia, or anywhere else in the region for that matter.
Our studies have shown that they will be able to eradicate malaria.
So you do understand the other side of your testimony is, therefore, we've been overpaying and over-appropriating AID all these years, because apparently we could have done with almost half of what we've been doing with no material effect, and these countries really could have been picking up the slack. They just didn't do it because we didn't cut it in half.
No, sir. The costs are up front. We're developing their capabilities and their institutions, and right from the beginning, we tell them we will be phasing out. They have to be able to assume the cost.
Ms. Still, I
They have
understand that,
agreed
but
to do
that
so.
begs the question of an abrupt and draconian cut, as is proposed, that the chairman pointed out to us. To try to absorb that is massive. I have to assume disruptive, as someone who managed programs myself, and for 10 years had oversight responsibility for AID in the United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I've never heard testimony like that, never from the Ronald Reagan administration. My time is up, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, and I appreciate it. But I want to add in here before we go to the next, Ms. Gabbard, if you'll indulge me just a minute. Austerity cuts are coming to this country. We know that, and I thought it was very pertinent of what you said, that they realize that they're going to have to step up. I was in the Congo about a year and a half ago, and we were sitting at the Foreign Ministry Cabinet. The president of the DRC would not meet with us, and we have given them hundreds of billions of dollars for years. And I asked very pointedly, what do you do for social programs? And their eyes kind of widened, and they're like, well, what do you mean? I said, for housing, for education, for medicine, insurance. And they said, we have you. That's not a good foreign policy. And we've spent all that money in the past, so things have to change. We're being forced into a situation, and I think some of this times, tough love, it may, and I'm not saying it's the best way, but in certain situations, especially in our economic downturn that we have, we need to make some changes. And I'm going to go to Ms. Gabbard from Hawaii right now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here. The administration has come before our committee and spoken publicly about their focus and efforts on a diplomatic solution or resolution to the North Korea threat and crisis. With China mobilizing its military along the North Korea border, stepping up its surveillance, it does not appear that serious diplomatic efforts are either working or continue to be underway beyond saying, well, we think Russia and China need to comply with sanctions. So I wonder if you can talk about how this budget actually supports a serious diplomatic strategy in resolving the threat from North Korea, and if so, what is it?
So I'll take that one. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think the budget, obviously we don't have assistance programs in North Korea, but it reflects the operational costs of our prioritization of the North Korea issue in our bureau. And I think what our strategy is looking like at the moment, we've made this the highest foreign policy priority of the administration. I think that is a change from previous practice. We have opened up a global pressure campaign in which we are asking other countries to step up to the plate and do more on pressuring North Korea. What happens when you try to squeeze off North Korea's proliferation networks and economic and financial networks is they go elsewhere. They go to Africa, they go to Southeast Asia, they go maybe to Latin America, and we're trying to have a global network and a global consciousness raising surrounding upping the pressure of both sanctions, but also diplomatic isolation vis-a-vis the North Korean regime, trying to build up a pressure campaign so that they can change the calculation that they've made surrounding the cost-benefit analysis of their weapons programs and their missile programs. And
So what
we are-
happens? What happens next beyond that? What happens next after
So we have
you
just
cook up the
started
pressure?
building the global pressure campaign, and basically in April, we've been talking, of course, to the Chinese and the Russians and other major players. The third change from previous practices that we have really put the onus on China to do a lot more than they've ever
And
done
are they?
before. And they are doing more than they've ever done before.
It seems like they're preparing for something other than a diplomatic solution at this point.
I would not necessarily go quite that far. I think they are very much focused on a peaceful resolution. They do agree that there needs to be an increase in pressure on the North Korean regime, and they want that to happen in a way that brings the North back to the negotiating table as quickly as possible. The problem is that right now the North doesn't seem to be very inclined to come back to the negotiating table with any kind of serious attitude or proposal. So what we're doing is continuing to sort of squeeze and close the vice and hope that that brings about a reckoning in North
Thank you.
Korea that they're paying too much for their weapons programs.
Thanks. I'd like to get one more question in here specifically about organizations like the Asia Foundation and the East-West Center, both of which have for decades provided a great contributions to engagement, formation of policy, building relationships within the region. This year, the administration's budget completely zeroes out funding for both of those organizations. We've been told that this was done because the administration believes they receive outside funding and no longer need any assistance from us. I'm wondering what specific evidence went into making that decision-making process. Specifically, were these organizations engaged directly? Did you hear directly from them? Because I can tell you, I have met with them year after year after year, and while they are making progress on leveraging the funding that they are getting, they are not able to continue to function if this administration continues to eliminate and zero their funding completely.
I have not been involved in the analysis that went into deciding whether Asia Foundation or the East Asia Pacific gets funding. We do know, though, that we've had to make tough prioritization of the programs that we would be funding.
So the justification that we got, though, was the administration's assessment that they could operate, continue to function purely on outside funding, but you don't know how that conclusion was reached or if there was any input or engagement with these organizations?
I was personally not involved in the discussions on funding for Asia Foundation.
So this is, I mean, you guys are the people to talk to in the State Department about the Asia Pacific, where these organizations are focused. So if it wasn't you, then, and your input was not sought in this direction, then whose was?
Well, we engage regularly in the Bureau with both Asia Foundation and the East-West Center, and so I think we've been keeping up a constant communication with them in recent years about the need to do more to wean themselves off of government funding, and I know that in particular East-West has changed its management and raised a capital campaign, et cetera, and so we're aware of all of those activities. The Asia Foundation, we also talk frequently with them. We're well aware of their programs in various countries, but I think in the prioritization this year, I think that was one of the hard choices that was made.
Okay, again, I've had these same conversations, encouraging them to continue to build their outside support, but to go from, I think it was East-West Center had $16 or $17 million last year to zero. You're setting up these organizations up for failure. Thank you.
Thank the ladies' questions and the responses you guys are giving. I'd like to move on to a second set of questions, if it's all right with you, if you guys can tolerate us. You know, I guess one of the biggest things I see is, you know, we are going to go through these cuts, and how many people are in state do you have a number of how many people are in the State Department total around the world?
I think the total number is, that I've heard the Secretary mention recently, something like 70,000.
70,000. So a 10% cut would be 7,000, 5% would be 3,500. So we're looking at less than a 5% cut if we cut 2,300. You know, we don't want to be forced to cut, but I think sometimes we do need to shrink down some things. And again, going into austerity measures that we see, we're teetering on them. We need to make sure that we're getting the most out of the money we're giving, at the most results. Saying that, did you know how the process went where they decided what programs they were going to cut? You guys have, as it said in the beginning, a lengthy career between you. So you've had a lot of experience. Were you able to weigh in and say these programs are good, these are bad?
Yeah, very much so. We have a very elaborate budget development process that takes in all levels of the State Department and AID, input from the field, builds up from there, and then we have sort of our top-level officials that have to make some hard decisions in consultation with us, and we have to make some choices.
All right, so you do get to weigh in on that.
Yes, we do, sir. And in addition, we look at where they are in the implementation, what progress they have made, what achievements they have made. And in making selections, we look at those that have been successful and no longer need any support from us because either someone else in the country will pick it up or the government itself will, as in the case of the health sector in Cambodia, then, you know, we begin to phase out. But we are very heavily involved, and it's data-based. We monitor and evaluate our programs and get rid of programs that are not producing and continue those that are showing a lot of progress. And then those that have achieved what they have to achieve, then we then phase them out.
When I was practicing as a veterinarian, when we had the economic downturn in, you know, the 2007 roughly, we had to go through and we had to trim budgets, we had to, you know, cut back overhead. And it's good to see that you guys are doing that you get to weigh in and you get to say these are the effective programs, these aren't. And I think that's a lesson to be learned. That's one of the ways that we're going to have to, you know, make these changes so that we can get a hold of our spending, so that we're not forced in really draconian cuts that will be much worse than this that we've seen in other countries. Saying that, knowing that Cambodia has got an election coming up in this next year, to assure free and fair elections, we have heard time and again that the robust election monitoring is needed. Will this budget support these needs, in your opinion? Because I see a 74% cut in the change for Cambodia between 2016 and 2018.
Yes, sir. We still have funds that are available. We are supporting two organizations in Cambodia. One is focused on working with civil society organizations to increase the participation of the youth and women, and the other organization is working with the National Election Commission to improve their performance so that they can be more transparent and credible. We do have funds at this moment, at this time, to support them.
All right, that's good to know. And I want to move on to, when it comes to countering China's growing influence, and this is something, if anything keeps me up late at night, this is something I worry about probably more than anything, or more concerned about, and I think we really need to pay more attention to. But when it comes to countering China's growing influence, what programs do you believe give us the most bang for our buck in terms of empowering our partners in the region to defend their territorial claims against China's growing aggression? Would it be the foreign military financing, support of governments? What are your thoughts on that, if I could hear from both of you?
Yeah, I'll just speak very briefly on this, but I think that the most important programs are diplomatic, economic, and security programs. Mostly the capacity building that we do in Asia with all of our Asian partners to improve governance, to improve their capacity to conduct international trade, to promote their integration with other partners in the region, to support regional organizations like APEC and ASEAN, and also to make sure that they have the capabilities that they need, of course, military and otherwise, law enforcement, et cetera, to protect their borders and defend their sovereignty. So.
let me get Ms. Steele to weigh in on that.
In the development area, we work with them to strengthen their democratic institutions, work with them on fighting corruption in order to level the playing field, and which China would have a hard time dealing with. And then we provide a real much better, more responsible and sustainable alternatives in all the other areas, in health and in the area of trade, looking at the regulations and making them more transparent.
All right, thank you. Now we'll turn to Mr. Sherman for another round.
Ms. Thornton, this is really kind of a worldwide question, so step above your pay grade, but does the president's budget involve a cut in broadcasting and other internet, other Voice of America, and similar activities?
I can't speak to the worldwide budget for that, but we do have money for broadcasting in Asia.
And how much money would you have under the president's budget versus how many you spent in the most recent year?
Well, I think we're actually continuing and maybe even enhancing some of our broadcasting area in Asia, specific to the North Korea challenge.
But overall, for the entire region that that you're here representing, or the Bureau, up or down?
Probably, I don't know, Gloria, do you know? BBG, I don't know.
Or if you would just want to
I'm
furnish
sure.
the...
I can take the question and get back to you. I'm not totally
Okay.
sure about the overall.
And in particular, we have an ideological battle in the Muslim world. The ISIS is reaching out, trying to recruit terrorists in the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Myanmar. And like you to specifically provide answers on whether your budget's going up or down in those Muslim majority or Muslim minority countries. Now, one issue that comes before us is this whole ratcheting up, war fever almost, regarding these little islets off the shores of China. We're told that we either should perhaps just spend hundreds of billions of dollars over the next few years, gearing up our whole military and spending more on our military to confront China, or maybe we should go to war. I mean, if we avoid an actual fighting war, we'll at least have a Cold War over these islets. We're told these islets are of critical significance, first because trillions of dollars of trade go close to those islands. Yes, it's all in and out of Chinese ports, and if the Chinese control these islands, they'd be in a position to blockade their own ports. There's some trade that is from oil tankers from the Gulf to Japan that could get close to these islands or could just as easily stay hundreds of miles away. So then the other reason we're given that we have to deploy our military and increase it is that we are incredibly, intensely concerned about maritime disputes and making sure that they're handled fairly. But there's no oil under these islets. They're so useless that no one has chosen to live there in all of recorded history. But there is a maritime dispute that is significant. That's the one between Australia and East Timor. Ms. Thornton, do we spend much time at the State Department worrying about that dispute?
Well, we actually have worked on the East Timor Australia dispute.
I know you've worked, but I mean, compare the national obsession with the islets I talked about to the level of staffing that goes on in your bureau with regard to this dispute.
But the difference is that they're in dispute resolution mechanism and have peacefully agreed to do that willingly by both sides, whereas the disputes in the South China Sea are actually the source of a
Well,
lot
I
of
mean, it'll
tension
obviously be
in the
peaceable
region, so-
because East Timor could not go to war against Australia, but whether they agree to a new dispute resolution or not depends upon Australia. So it's these islands. Well, I've taken enough time. We were just going to do a short second round. So I'll yield back. I'll say simply that there are 40, at least 20, perhaps as many as 40 maritime disputes around the world. We don't have our ships going eyeball to eyeball with the second most powerful nation in the world over any of these. I couldn't even name for you the third most significant maritime dispute in the world. I give myself credit for knowing of the East Timor one, which I believe is the second if oil matters. So the idea that the United States always must spend hundreds of billions of dollars to involve itself in each and every maritime dispute is not always true, and I yield back.
I thank you, gentlemen, and I thank your responses on this, but I want to comment on that because there are a lot of maritime disputes around the world, but how many of them have 10,000-foot runways? How many of them have military barracks? How many of them are militarized with both offensive and defensive weapons and radar systems? And I will agree there is a lighthouse on there for peaceful navigational purposes. And I think this is something because we do see an aggressive China. We've seen what they've done with Taiwan. They're boxing them in. We've seen what they've done with Hong Kong. And I think this is something it's like anything else in life. If you've got a problem, if you ignore it, it's not going to go away. It'll get worse, and it's going to be worse to deal with and more expensive and more costly. And we know—
Mr. Chairman, if you'll yield, the disputes involving Cyprus, its offshore natural gas fields, islands between Greece and Turkey, have also involved military preparations involving 2 NATO countries we might have an even greater interest in, and yet we're not pivoting toward the Eastern Mediterranean in an effort to prove to Turkey or Greece that we're going to be involved in that dispute. But I realize that not only has the United States wildly exaggerated the importance of these islands, it also meets political needs in Beijing to wildly exaggerate their importance, and building an airfield is just one way of pandering to excessive nationalism in China.
I will look forward to having more debates on that, because what I see is a nation like China has claimed sovereignty to areas that the rest of the world says is not yours. And they went to the World Court. Vietnam challenged them. They lost the case. They ignored that. And we see them doing what they're doing. We've seen also some of their trade practices that are not conducive to open trade and honest trade. And I think it's something that we need to pay attention to. And I agree. I'm not willing to, hang on just a minute, I'm not willing to enter another conflict. I don't want to. I don't know anybody that wants that. And I'm not wanting to bolster this by ourselves or try to offset this by ourselves. But when you look at the ASEAN nations, there's the 10 ASEAN nations, that's 633 million people roughly, $2.5 trillion in GDP. If we create a vacuum, we know the rules of nature. Nature abhors a vacuum. It will be filled by somebody. And it's something we need to come together, and that's why it's so important that the cuts in foreign aid through State Department, that you guys redirect the aid that you do have so that we form those strong alliances, as we said in the beginning of this meeting, that we form those strong partnerships in economic and trade, and we focus on aid, not trade, trade, not aid, so that we can wean countries off and so that they can enter that realm of those countries, those top 15 countries that we trade with today, the 12 of them that were recipients of foreign aid, so that these other countries can move into that and that we can wean these off, creating stronger alliances. Do you have anything else you want to add, Mr. Sherman?
Just that if instead of deploying the U.S. Navy to worry about these islets, you want to deploy it to protect our ports from unfair Chinese imports, you may have a partner in that.
I look forward to having that discussion. I think we could agree on that. Ms. Thornton, I thank you for your testimony, for the questionings you went through, Ms. Steele. I thank you for your time here, and I thank you for your service to our nation. And with that, with no further comments or questions, this meeting is adjourned.